On the morning of March 7, 1983, a maintenance worker in the Moscow metro descended into a service tunnel beneath Arbatskaya station and noticed something that would unravel one of the most sophisticated CIA operations ever conducted on Soviet soil. His name was Viktor Sergeyevich Volkov, and he had been working in the metro system for 11 years, long enough to know when something was out of place in the vast underground network that carried millions of passengers through the heart of the Soviet capital every day. What he found that morning was a ventilation grate that had been removed and replaced incorrectly, the bolts slightly misaligned, the metal frame sitting at an angle that was almost imperceptible to anyone who did not spend their working life in these tunnels. But Victor noticed, and that small detail would lead to the capture of a CIA officer who had been operating undetected in Moscow for nearly 3 years. The Moscow metro was more than just a transportation system. It was a symbol of Soviet engineering and architectural achievement, a showcase of marble halls and chandeliers and mosaics depicting the triumph of the worker and the glory of the state. But beneath the ornate stations, beyond the platforms where citizens waited for trains, there existed a labyrinth of service tunnels, electrical conduits, drainage systems, and abandoned construction passages that few people ever saw. The network extended for hundreds of kilometers, much of it unmapped in public documents, and it connected not just metro stations, but also government buildings, military installations, and communication centers. For intelligence agencies, both Soviet and Western, the metro system represented an opportunity and a vulnerability, a vast underground infrastructure where surveillance equipment could be hidden, dead drops established, and escape routes maintained. The CIA had been aware of this potential since the early 1970s, when signals intelligence intercepts suggested that certain Soviet military communications were being routed through cables that ran parallel to metro tunnels. The information was fragmentary, gathered from defectors and technical analysis, but it indicated that if an operative could gain access to specific locations beneath the metro, they might be able to tap into communications lines that carried classified military traffic. The problem was access. The metro system was heavily guarded, not just by uniformed militia but by plainclothes KGB officers who monitored passengers and workers for any sign of suspicious behavior. Foreign nationals were watched constantly, their movements logged, their contacts noted. Any attempt to enter restricted areas would trigger immediate investigation. The CIA needed someone who could move through the metro system without attracting attention, someone who could blend into the environment so completely that their presence would be invisible. That person was Daniel Robert Ashford, a 34-year-old case officer who had been recruited by the CIA in 1976 while completing a doctorate in Slavic linguistics at Georgetown University. Ashford had grown up in Chicago, the son of a steelworker and a librarian, and he had developed an early fascination with Russian literature and history. By the time he graduated from high school, he was fluent in Russian, and by the time he finished his undergraduate degree at Northwestern, he could speak the language with the accent and idioms of a native Muscovite. The CIA had been watching him since his junior year, and when he applied to graduate school, they approached him with an offer. "Complete your studies," they told him, "develop your cover as an academic, and then come work for us." Ashford agreed, not because he was particularly ideological or patriotic, but because the work seemed intellectually challenging, and because he believed, as many young Americans did, in the wake of Vietnam and Watergate, that the intelligence community needed people who could think critically and operate with moral clarity. His training began in 1977 at a facility known simply as The Farm, located in rural Virginia, where CIA officers learned tradecraft, surveillance detection, dead drop procedures, and the psychological techniques necessary to recruit and handle assets. Ashford excelled in the linguistic components of training, but he struggled initially with the physical demands of operational work. He was not naturally athletic, not the kind of person who could scale walls or fight his way out of dangerous situations. But he was patient, methodical, and capable of sustaining a cover identity for extended periods without breaking character. His instructors noted that he had an unusual ability to disappear into a role, to become so thoroughly immersed in a false identity that even people who knew him well could not detect inconsistencies. This was the quality that made him valuable, and it was the quality that would eventually place him beneath Arbatskaya station with a set of listening devices and a cover story that depended on a single, fragile lie. The operation was codenamed Timber Wolf, and it had been in development since 1979, when the CIA had obtained detailed schematics of the Moscow Metro from a Polish engineer who had worked on construction projects in the Soviet Union during the 1960s. The schematics showed that certain tunnels beneath Arbatskaya station ran within meters of underground communication cables that connected the Ministry of Defense with military command centers outside Moscow. If an operative could access those tunnels and install listening equipment on the cables, the CIA might be able to intercept communications related to Soviet missile deployments, troop movements, and strategic planning. The technical challenges were significant, requiring specialized equipment that could tap into fiber optic and copper wire systems without triggering detection protocols. But the operational challenges were even more daunting. Getting an American case officer into Moscow and keeping them there long enough to complete the installation required a cover identity that could withstand sustained KGB scrutiny. The cover identity chosen for Ashford was that of a Canadian graduate student researching Soviet urban planning and transportation systems. His legend was built meticulously over 18 months, beginning with the creation of academic credentials from the University of Toronto, where CIA officers posing as faculty members added his name to enrollment records and published articles under his byline in obscure academic journals. He was given a backstory that placed him in Montreal, where he had supposedly grown up in a French-speaking household before moving to Toronto for university. He was provided with family photographs, childhood friends who could be referenced in casual conversation, and a detailed knowledge of Canadian geography and culture that would hold up under questioning. The legend was solid, but it was also fragile in the way that all deep cover identities are fragile. One mistake, one inconsistency, one moment of hesitation when asked a question about his past, and the entire structure would collapse. Ashford arrived in Moscow on June 14, 1981, carrying a Canadian passport, a letter of introduction from his supposed thesis advisor, and a suitcase containing nothing that would suggest he was anything other than what he claimed to be. He passed through customs without incident, endured the standard interrogation about the purpose of his visit, and was assigned a room in a hotel designated for foreign visitors. For the first 6 months, he did exactly what a graduate student researching urban planning would do. He visited libraries, took photographs of metro stations, conducted interviews with transportation officials, and wrote lengthy notes in notebooks that were periodically inspected by KGB officers during surprise searches of his hotel room. He established a routine, always taking the same routes through the city, always eating at the same cafeterias, always returning to his hotel at predictable times. The goal was to become so familiar, so unremarkable, that the surveillance teams assigned to monitor him would grow complacent and reduce their attention. By January of 1982, the surveillance had noticeably decreased. Ashford still saw the same faces following him occasionally, still noticed the same cars parked outside locations he visited, but the intensity had diminished. The KGB had evaluated him and concluded that he was exactly what he appeared to be, a harmless academic with no intelligence connections and no suspicious contacts. This was the moment when the operational phase of Timberwolf could begin, but it required waiting for the right circumstances, the right opportunity to access the metro tunnels without triggering alarms. That opportunity came in March of 1982, when Ashford learned through a conversation with a transportation engineer that the metro system was conducting routine maintenance on ventilation systems in several older stations, including Arbatskaya. Maintenance work meant that sections of the tunnels would be temporarily accessible, that workers would be moving in and out of restricted areas, and that security protocols might be relaxed just enough to allow someone with the right credentials to enter without raising suspicion. The plan was simple in concept, but complex in execution. Ashford would obtain temporary employment as a maintenance assistant, a position that required minimal qualifications and the turnover rate suggested would not attract significant background scrutiny. He would use forged documents provided by the CIA to establish employment history with a construction firm in Leningrad, references that would be difficult for the KGB to verify quickly, and he would present himself as someone looking for short-term work while continuing his academic research. The risk was substantial. If the KGB conducted a thorough background check, the forgeries would be detected and Ashford would be arrested. But if the hiring process was as bureaucratic and indifferent as CIA analysts believed, he might slip through and gain access to the tunnels. On March 23, 1982, Ashford applied for a position with the Moscow Metro Maintenance Division, submitting his forged employment documents and references to a supervisor at a depot near Sokolniki station. The supervisor, a man named Grigory Mikhailovich Petrov, glanced at the paperwork, asked a few cursory questions about Ashford's experience, and hired him on the spot. Ashford reported for work the following Monday, and for the next 11 months he worked as a maintenance assistant, cleaning tunnels, repairing ventilation systems, and performing the kind of manual labor that allowed him to move through restricted areas without attracting attention. He was careful never to deviate from his assigned tasks, never to show too much interest in areas that were not part of his work orders, and never to engage in conversations that might reveal inconsistencies in his background. He became, for all practical purposes, invisible, just another worker in a system that employed thousands of people and where individual faces blurred into anonymity. During this period, Ashford identified the specific location beneath Arbatskaya station where the communication cables were accessible. The cables ran through a narrow conduit approximately 20 meters from a ventilation shaft, and the conduit was located in a section of tunnel that was visited infrequently by maintenance crews. The installation of listening equipment would require removing a ventilation grate, accessing the conduit, attaching the devices to the cables, and then replacing the grate in a way that would not be immediately noticeable. The equipment itself had been smuggled into Moscow in pieces over the course of several months, hidden in shipments of electronic components that were ostensibly destined for Soviet research institutions, but that were actually routed through CIA assets who transferred them to Ashford during carefully orchestrated dead drops. The devices were small, no larger than a pack of cigarettes, and they were designed to transmit intercepted communications to a receiver located in a safe house operated by the CIA in a residential neighborhood approximately 4 kilometers from Arbatskaya station. The installation took place on the night of February 16, 1983, during a maintenance shift when Ashford was assigned to inspect ventilation systems in the tunnels beneath Arbatskaya. He waited until the other workers had moved to a different section of the tunnel, then removed the ventilation grate using a wrench from his toolkit, accessed the conduit, and attached the listening devices to the cables using adhesive that would hold them in place indefinitely. The entire process took less than 12 minutes, and when he replaced the grate, he believed he had done so in a way that would not be detected. He was wrong. In his haste to complete the installation and return to his assigned work area before his absence was noticed, he had tightened the bolts in the wrong sequence, leaving the grates slightly misaligned. It was a small mistake, the kind of error that someone unfamiliar with the equipment might make, but it was visible to anyone who knew what to look for. Viktor Volkov found the misaligned grate 19 days later, on the morning of March 7th. He had been conducting a routine inspection of ventilation systems, walking through tunnels he had walked through hundreds of times when he noticed the grate. At first, he thought nothing of it. Maintenance crews sometimes removed grates for inspections and replaced them imperfectly. But something about the way the grate sat on its frame bothered him, and he stopped to examine it more closely. When he removed the grate entirely and looked inside the conduit, he saw the listening devices attached to the cables. He did not know what they were, but he knew they were not supposed to be there, and he knew that their presence in a restricted section of the metro system was something that needed to be reported immediately. Victor climbed out of the tunnel and walked to a supervisor's office, where he explained what he had found. The supervisor, a man named Alexei Ivanovich Kuznetsov, listened to Victor's description and immediately understood the implications. Equipment attached to communication cables in a restricted area of the metro system could only mean one thing: someone had gained unauthorized access to those tunnels and installed surveillance devices. Kuznetsov contacted the KGB, and within 2 hours, a team of counterintelligence officers arrived at Arbatskaya station and descended into the tunnels to examine the devices. The officers photographed the equipment, documented its location, and then left it in place. The decision was made not to remove the devices immediately, but to monitor them and identify who had installed them. The KGB believed correctly that whoever had placed the equipment would eventually return to check on it or retrieve data, and that return visit would provide an opportunity to make an arrest. The surveillance operation began the following day. KGB officers were stationed in the tunnels near the ventilation conduit, hidden in alcoves and behind equipment, waiting for someone to approach the grate. Additional officers monitored the entrance points to the maintenance areas, logging the identity of every worker who entered and exited. The operation continued for 6 days without any significant activity. Maintenance crews came and went, performing their assigned tasks, and none of them showed any interest in the ventilation grate where the devices had been found. The KGB began to consider the possibility that whoever had installed the equipment had already left the area, that the operation had been completed, and the operative had extracted before detection. But on March 13th, Ashford returned to the tunnel. He had been monitoring the listening devices remotely from the safe house, and the data being transmitted had suddenly stopped on the morning of March 7th, the same day Victor had discovered the equipment. Ashford knew that the silence could mean several things. The devices had malfunctioned, the cables had been disconnected, or the equipment had been discovered. He needed to determine which scenario was correct, and the only way to do that was to return to the tunnel and inspect the installation. He knew the risk was enormous, that returning to the site after a potential compromise was a violation of every operational protocol he had been taught. But the data being intercepted was too valuable to abandon without confirmation, and Ashford believed that if the KGB had found the equipment, they would have removed it immediately rather than leaving it in place. He was making assumptions based on what he thought the KGB would do, and those assumptions would prove catastrophic. Ashford entered the tunnels beneath Arbatskaya station on the afternoon of March 13th, carrying his maintenance toolkit and wearing the same work clothes he always wore. He walked through the passages he had walked through dozens of times, nodding to other workers he passed, maintaining the same unremarkable demeanor that had allowed him to operate undetected for nearly 2 years. When he reached the section of tunnel where the ventilation grate was located, he saw no one nearby. The area appeared deserted, and the lighting was dim enough that he could work without being easily observed from a distance. He knelt beside the grate, removed his wrench from his toolkit, and began loosening the bolts. As he removed the grate and reached into the conduit to check the listening devices, 6 KGB officers emerged from concealment and surrounded him. The arrest was conducted without violence. Ashford did not resist, did not attempt to run, did not reach for any weapon or device that might have been hidden in his toolkit. He simply stood up, raised his hands and waited as the officers searched him, confiscated his toolkit, and placed him in handcuffs. He was escorted out of the tunnel, taken to a waiting vehicle, and transported to Lefortovo prison, a facility in eastern Moscow that served as the KGB's primary interrogation center for espionage cases. He was placed in a cell approximately 2 meters by 3 meters, with a concrete floor, a narrow cot, and a single light bulb that remained on constantly. He was not beaten, not tortured in any physical sense, but he was subjected to interrogation sessions that lasted for hours, sometimes extending through the night, designed to exhaust him and break down his psychological defenses. The interrogations were conducted by a team led by Major Yuri Alexandrovich Sokolov, a counterintelligence officer with 15 years of experience in breaking foreign operatives. Sokolov was methodical, patient, and skilled at identifying inconsistencies in cover stories. He began by asking Ashford about his Canadian identity, requesting details about his childhood in Montreal, his education in Toronto, the thesis he was supposedly writing. Ashford answered every question, providing the information that had been rehearsed and memorized during his training. But Sokolov was listening not just for facts, but for the subtle tells that indicated someone was reciting a script rather than recalling genuine memories. He asked Ashford to describe specific neighborhoods in Montreal, to name teachers from his high school, to explain family traditions during holidays. Ashford answered, but his responses were too perfect, too rehearsed, lacking the small errors and digressions that characterize authentic memory. After 3 days of questioning, Sokolov shifted tactics. He stopped asking about Ashford's Canadian identity and began asking about his work in the metro tunnels. He showed Ashford photographs of the listening devices, asked him to explain what they were and how they had been installed. Ashford denied any knowledge of the equipment, claimed he had been inspecting the ventilation system as part of his assigned duties, and had no idea the devices were there. Sokolov did not argue with him, did not challenge the denial directly. Instead, he presented evidence that had been gathered during the KGB's investigation of Ashford's background. The employment documents Ashford had submitted when applying for the maintenance position had been examined, and the references he had provided had been contacted. The construction firm in Leningrad that supposedly employed him did not exist at the address listed, and the supervisors he had named were unknown to anyone in the construction industry. The documents were forgeries, and the KGB had traced them back to a network of operatives who had been under surveillance for months. On the 5th day of interrogation, Sokolov confronted Ashford with this information, laying out the evidence in a calm, almost conversational tone. He explained that the KGB knew Ashford was not a Canadian graduate student, that his academic credentials were fabricated, that his entire identity was a cover constructed by Western intelligence. He offered Ashford an opportunity to cooperate, to provide information about his handlers, his operational objectives, the methods used to smuggle equipment into the Soviet Union. In exchange, Sokolov suggested the consequences might be less severe. Ashford listened but did not respond. He understood that anything he said could be used to identify other CIA officers, compromise ongoing operations, and endanger assets who were still active in the Soviet Union. He had been trained to resist interrogation, to withstand psychological pressure, to reveal nothing that could aid the enemy. But he had not been trained for the exhaustion, the isolation, the relentless grinding down of his will that occurred over days and weeks in Lefortovo. By the end of the 2nd week, Ashford was no longer certain how long he had been in custody. The constant light in his cell made it impossible to distinguish day from night, and the irregular schedule of interrogations disrupted any sense of time. He slept in brief intervals, waking to the sound of guards approaching his cell, never knowing if he would be taken for another session with Sokolov or left alone. His mind began to fragment, Memories of his real life in Chicago, mixing with memories of the Canadian identity he had inhabited for 2 years, he found himself unable to remember which details were true and which were fabricated, unable to distinguish between the person he had been and the person he had pretended to be. On March 28th, 15 days after his arrest, Ashford was informed that he would be formally charged with espionage under Article 64 of the Criminal Code of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. The penalty for espionage, Sokolov explained, was death by firing squad, though the sentence could be commuted to long-term imprisonment if Ashford cooperated with the investigation. Ashford was given 24 hours to consider his options, and during that time he was returned to his cell and left alone. He sat on the narrow cot, staring at the concrete wall, and thought about the choices that had brought him to this moment. He thought about the CIA officers who had recruited him, who had assured him that the operation was carefully planned and that the risks were manageable. He thought about the listening devices he had installed beneath Arbatskaya Station, devices that might have intercepted valuable intelligence or might have transmitted nothing before being discovered. He thought about Viktor Volkov, the maintenance worker whose attention to detail had unraveled everything, and he wondered if there was any scenario in which the operation could have succeeded, any decision he could have made differently that would have changed the outcome. The following day, Ashford informed Sokolov that he would not cooperate, that he would not provide information about CIA operations or identify other officers. Sokolov accepted this decision without visible emotion, noting only that Ashford's refusal would be documented in the case file and considered during sentencing. The trial was held in a closed military tribunal on April 19, 1983, with proceedings conducted entirely in Russian and no representatives from the Canadian government present, since the Soviet Union did not recognize Ashford's claimed nationality. The evidence against him was presented systematically. The forged employment documents, the listening devices found in the metro tunnels, the testimony of Viktor Volkov describing the discovery of the equipment, and photographs showing Ashford removing the ventilation grate on the day of his arrest. Ashford was provided with a defense attorney, a military lawyer assigned by the state, who argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that Ashford had been entrapped by KGB officers who had allowed the devices to remain in place as bait. The argument was perfunctory, and the judge dismissed it without serious consideration. The verdict was delivered on April 20th. Ashford was found guilty of espionage and sentenced to 18 years in a labor camp in the Perm region, approximately 1,000 kilometers east of Moscow. The sentence was lighter than it might have been, reflecting the KGB's assessment that Ashford had been a field operative with limited knowledge of broader CIA operations and that his interrogation had yielded no actionable intelligence. He was transferred to the labor camp in early May, transported in a prison convoy that took 4 days to reach the remote facility where he would spend the next decade and a half. The camp was located in a heavily forested area, surrounded by barbed wire fences and guard towers, and it housed approximately 800 prisoners, most of them convicted of political crimes or espionage. The conditions were harsh but not brutal. Prisoners worked in logging operations during the day, felling trees and processing timber, and they were housed in barracks that provided minimal protection from the cold during winter months. Food was adequate, medical care was sporadic, and contact with the outside world was limited to occasional letters that were heavily censored by camp administrators. Ashford adapted to the routine, learning to endure the physical labor and the monotony of camp life. He spoke little, kept to himself, and avoided conflicts with other prisoners. Over time, he became known among the inmates as someone who could translate documents and write letters for those who were illiterate, and this skill provided him with a degree of protection from the more violent prisoners who might otherwise have seen him as a target. He received no communication from the CIA, no indication that the agency was attempting to negotiate his release or exchange him for Soviet operatives held in the West. He had been abandoned, left to serve his sentence in a place that most Americans would never know existed. In November of 1987, Ashford learned through a conversation with another prisoner that a maintenance worker in the Moscow metro had been awarded a commendation for vigilance in discovering foreign intelligence equipment in the tunnels beneath Arbatskaya station. The prisoner had read about the award in a newspaper that had been smuggled into the camp, and he mentioned it casually, unaware that the commendation referred to the operation that had led to Ashford's arrest. Ashford listened without comment, but the information stayed with him. Viktor Volkov had been recognized for doing his job, for noticing a small detail that most people would have overlooked, and that recognition had been enough to unravel 2 years of work and consign Ashford to a labor camp where he would spend the best years of his life. The Soviet Union collapsed in December of 1991, and in the chaos that followed, many political prisoners and individuals convicted of espionage were released as part of broader amnesty programs. Ashford was released in March of 1992, 9 years into his 18-year sentence, and he was deported to the United States via Poland. He arrived in New York on March 23rd, exactly 10 years after he had applied for work in the Moscow metro, and he was met by CIA officers who debriefed him for 6 weeks, documenting everything he could remember about his arrest, interrogation, and imprisonment. The agency offered him financial compensation, medical care, and assistance reintegrating into civilian life, but Ashford declined most of it. He moved to a small town in Oregon, found work as a translator, and lived quietly, avoiding contact with former colleagues and refusing requests for interviews about his time in the Soviet Union. Viktor Volkov continued working in the Moscow metro until his retirement in 2003. He never spoke publicly about the incident in March of 1983, and he was never interviewed by journalists or historians researching Cold War espionage. He died in 2007 at the age of 68, and his obituary in a local Moscow newspaper made no mention of the commendation he had received or the role he had played in exposing a CIA operation. For Viktor, the discovery of the listening devices had been nothing more than an unusual event in an otherwise ordinary career, a moment when he had done what he was trained to do and reported something that seemed out of place. The listening devices installed by Ashford were removed from the metro tunnels and analyzed by Soviet technical specialists who determined that they were capable of intercepting both voice communications and data transmissions from the military cables. The devices were never put on public display, and the details of their design and capabilities remained classified until the collapse of the Soviet Union, when some of the documents related to the case were transferred to Russian archives and made accessible to researchers. The intelligence gathered by the devices during the brief period they were operational, approximately 19 days, was minimal and consisted mostly of routine communications that provided no significant strategic value. The operation known as Timber Wolf was classified as a failure in CIA assessments conducted after Ashford's arrest. The agency concluded that the decision to use a deep cover operative for a technical installation had been flawed, that the risks of detection had been underestimated, and that the operational security protocols had not adequately accounted for the possibility of discovery by maintenance personnel. The case became a training example within the agency, studied by officers learning how small mistakes in tradecraft, like incorrectly aligning a ventilation grate, could compromise entire operations and result in the capture of field operatives who had spent years building their covers. Daniel Ashford lived in Oregon for 18 years after his release from the Soviet labor camp. He never married, maintained few friendships, and spent much of his time alone. He worked as a translator of Russian literature, producing English versions of novels and poetry collections that were published by small academic presses. In 2010, he was diagnosed with lung cancer, likely the result of years spent working in poorly ventilated tunnels and breathing the polluted air of the labor camp. He died in January of 2011 at the age of 62, and his death was noted briefly in an obituary published in a Portland newspaper that described him as a retired linguist and translator. The obituary made no mention of his work for the CIA, his arrest in Moscow, or the years he spent in a Soviet labor camp. He had requested that no memorial service be held, and his ashes were scattered in a forest near his home without ceremony. The story of how a Soviet metro worker exposed a CIA spy hiding beneath the tracks is not a story about heroism or villainy. It is a story about the mundane realities of intelligence work, about how operations that seem carefully planned can be undone by small errors, and how the lives of operatives can be destroyed not by dramatic betrayals, but by routine observations made by ordinary people doing their jobs. Viktor Volkov was not a counterintelligence specialist, not a trained officer skilled in detecting espionage. He was a maintenance worker who noticed that a ventilation grate was misaligned, and that observation was enough to expose an operation that had taken years to develop and months to execute. Daniel Ashford was not a reckless operative, not someone who made obvious mistakes or violated basic protocols. He was a careful, methodical officer who made one error in a moment of haste, and that error cost him his freedom and ultimately his life. The lessons of Timber Wolf were absorbed into CIA training programs, incorporated into the curriculum taught to new case officers learning tradecraft and operational security. But those lessons could not change the fundamental reality of intelligence work, which is that no matter how carefully an operation is planned, no matter how thoroughly a cover identity is constructed, there will always be variables that cannot be controlled, details that cannot be anticipated, and people who notice things that were meant to go unnoticed. The ventilation grate beneath Arbatskaya station was replaced correctly after the listening devices were removed, and the metro system continued to operate as it always had, carrying millions of passengers through the tunnels every day, none of them aware that anything unusual had ever happened there. The only people who remembered were those directly involved, and as they died or moved on with their lives, the memory of the operation faded until it became nothing more than a classified file in an archive, a footnote in the history of Cold War espionage, a reminder that even the most sophisticated intelligence operations can be undone by the simplest observations.